Hello there. Tonight we're going to drift softly into candlelit courts and marble palaces where whispers echoed louder than truths and bloodlines twisted like ivy around crumbling thrones. Outside your window, maybe there's a faint breeze. Here inside this story, there's the rustle of taffeta, the creak of velvet shoes over polished stone, and the quiet panic of someone about to marry their first cousin. Again. You probably won't survive this journey genetically speaking, but don't worry, that's what makes it interesting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. I'm curious, what city are you listening from tonight and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little history community stretches. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The thing about royal families in Europe, especially from the Middle Ages through the 18th century, is that they didn't marry to find love. They married to prevent war, to consolidate thrones, to avoid handing over land to outsiders who didn't know how to use a salad fork or pray in Latin. And for centuries, that made a kind of twisted sense. If you're a king and your daughter marries a neighboring prince, you might just be giving away your castles, your territory, and your strategic ports in one veiled teenager's dowry. But if she marries your nephew or your second cousin or that one particularly religious uncle who never quite stopped looking like a sallow version of your great uncle Lothar, then the family keeps everything, including the chin. It wasn't called inbreeding then. Not really. It was called dynastic continuity. It was policy. A chess move that didn't stop with pawns, but played out in uterine blood types, in miscarriages and malformed bones. Inside the flickering court of Habsburg, Spain, Bourbon, France, and Trastamara, Castile girls were born knowing they had a job to marry someone already on the guest list at family weddings, preferably a close one. Picture it, you're 13, dressed in velvet and pearls, and your governess whispers that you've been promised to the heir of Denmark. Sounds exciting until you realize that he's also your second cousin, or worse, your uncle. But no one blinks. Your mother smiles. The priest has a dispensation already signed by the Pope, and the court musicians are practicing something cheerful for the wedding feast. One historical fact that rarely gets mentioned in textbooks: many of these marriages required special papal permission because canon law forbade close kin from marrying. But for royals, the Pope often looked the other way. After all, what's a little shared DNA when there's a throne at stake? Over time, this pattern didn't just repeat, it compounded. The family trees began to fold inward. Instead of branching out like healthy oaks, they curled into themselves like origami gone wrong. You end up with double first cousins getting married, which means both their mothers and their fathers were siblings. Yes, that's a thing. And that's how you get an entire dynasty with one jawline, one personality, and one immune system that collapses like wet paper. Historians still debate whether royal advisors understood the long-term risks. They probably didn't have the words we use today, no talk of recessive genes or alleles, but they definitely noticed patterns. Children with swollen heads, infertile brides, queens who bled for days after childbirth and never got up again. But there was a strange sort of resignation about it. If a child died young, it was God's will. If a queen had 4 miscarriages and then delivered a stillborn boy, well, that was just the burden of divine duty. And if your heir had a jaw so protruding that he couldn't chew food or close his mouth, then you painted him in profile and made sure the court poets wrote about his piety instead. Take the Habsburgs, for example. They were the Olympic champions of inbreeding. Their family tree wasn't so much a tree as a decorative wreath, beautiful, symmetrical, and utterly doomed. And it wasn't just in Spain. In Austria, France, Portugal, even England, royal houses began braiding themselves tighter and tighter. Marriages were arranged before children had their baby teeth. cousins grew up knowing their futures were already betrothed, sometimes with matching coats of arms and cradle linens embroidered with both names. One of the strangest facts: there were royal women who were technically their husband's great aunts. Some were their uncle's wives, some their brothers-in-law's daughters. In some cases, a woman could be her child's second cousin and half-niece at the same time. This didn't just affect the children. The women themselves bore the cost. Literally, they were the bodies through which dynasties passed. And when something went wrong, it was rarely the man's fault. If the heir died young, the queen had failed. If the baby was born misshapen, the queen had sinned. If there were no children at all, well, perhaps God was punishing her family line. Never mind that her husband was also her cousin and his jaw looked like a shovel. A quirky but haunting example: some royal birth rooms had tiny coffins already carved and painted waiting behind the nursery walls. Just in case. These weren't rare occurrences. Infant mortality among inbred royal lines was astronomically high. Entire generations were born only to be buried quietly behind chapel altars, their names fading into prayer books and genealogical scrolls. And yet the pattern continued. One Spanish court physician wrote in the 17th century that a queen's melancholia of the womb might be caused by excessive devotion. In other words, praying too hard could make you infertile. Meanwhile, no one questioned the fact that the queen's husband was also her uncle and had a family history of epilepsy, tremors, and tongue enlargement. Even the portraits tell a story. If you flip through Habsburg paintings from the 15th to the 17th century, you can see the jaws getting wider, the faces more elongated, the eyes less symmetrical. These were the signs not just of royalty, but of repetition. Of DNA, saying, hey, maybe let's marry outside the chapel choir this time. But they didn't. Not yet. Because empires were still expanding. Gold was still flowing from the Americas. And as long as the crowns stayed on the same heads, no one cared whether those heads came with extra chins. So here we begin on the threshold of firelit castles and anxious bloodlines. Tonight we'll walk through their corridors, not to judge, but to observe, to linger with the women who bore the weight of dynasties and whose names now drift through the folds of history like pressed flowers in a family Bible. We'll meet them one by one. And first we'll travel north to a girl wrapped in velvet and expectation, whose birth was the result of multiple cousin marriages, and whose future, unsurprisingly, was no different. She was Isabella, and she was the Habsburgs' next move. Isabella of Habsburg wasn't just born into royalty, she was distilled from it. Every thread in her family tapestry was gold-wrapped and cousin-woven, stretched tightly over generations of strategy disguised as lineage. Her arrival in 1501 didn't just mark the birth of a princess, it marked another turn in the spiral staircase of dynastic ambition, a human gemstone passed between kingdoms, set in a crown with too many prongs. You could say she sparkled, but only because she was under pressure. She was born in Brussels to Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile. Her parents were not just royal, they were related. Not in a distant, we share an ancestor back in the Viking Age kind of way. No. Isabella's parents were both grandchildren of the same royal couple, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the so-called Catholic monarchs of Spain. That made her the product of a double first cousin union, a kind of genetic bottleneck, where the royal blood ran so concentrated you could practically hear it echo. From the moment she first cried in her velvet cradle, Isabella was not her own. She belonged to Europe. A diplomatic chit with curls and dimples passed between dynasties like a well-bred racehorse with a useful uterus. And from the very beginning, everyone knew where she was headed. By the time she was a teenager, 13 to be precise, she was shipped north to marry Christian II of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It wasn't a love match. It was a chess move. Scandinavia was slipping, Christian needed allies, and the Habsburgs wanted influence. Isabella was the treaty wrapped in silk and sealed with a ring. Her dowry was enormous, her expectations even more so. Now let's talk about Christian for a moment. Described by some as brooding and mercurial, and by others more politely as unstable Christian, was a man who rarely did what others wanted. He already had a mistress named Dyveke Sigbridsdatter, a commoner, and he had no intention of letting her go. Not for a foreign princess, not even one sown from imperial bloodlines. So there was Isabella barely past childhood in a foreign land, with snow-dusted towers and bone-chilling wind, married to a man who preferred the company of someone else entirely. Dyveke didn't just stay in Christian's life, she was paraded openly through court dining with nobles, attending functions, and riding beside the king. Imagine the optics. The queen wrapped in layers of protocol and gold-threaded gowns, watching from a distance as her husband laughed with his low-born lover. It must have stung, even for a woman raised to expect nothing else. Still, Isabella did what Habsburg women were trained to do: endure. She gave birth to 6 children, 3 of whom survived infancy, in a world where mortality came before language. That was a triumph. One of her daughters, Dorothea, would go on to marry, yes, a cousin. The cycle by this point was less a family tree and more a family circle. Dyveke eventually died under suspicious circumstances. Poisoned cherries, some said. Others whispered about political enemies or courtly schemes. A few looked toward Isabella. Had she ordered it? Had her allies? There was no proof, there never is, but the timing was curious. Shortly after Dyveke's death, Isabella's influence at court began to rise. She moved more freely. She spoke more often. Christian, now without his companion, turned slightly inward toward his wife. But Isabella's ascent was brief. Her health had never been robust. Through her short life, she suffered periodic illness, fevers, fatigue, and episodes some modern historians suspect were linked to inherited blood disorders, possibly hemophilia, possibly something else. The records are vague, filled with phrases like a wasting, or the queen was taken to bed. But one thing is certain: by age 24, Isabella was dead. The official cause, a sudden illness. That classic medieval umbrella term that could cover anything from tuberculosis to an aneurysm to complications from a body straining under centuries of compounded DNA. She was buried with ceremony, praised for her virtue, her piety, her dignity, but rarely for her intelligence, which was by all accounts sharp. Isabella was fluent in 5 languages: Latin, Castilian, French, Flemish, and German. Her letters are filled with subtle sarcasm and political insight. In one, she described a Danish courtier as having the ambition of a lion with the elegance of a mule. It's the kind of line that makes you sit up in bed and smile into the dark. Historians still debate her legacy. Some argue she was just another dynastic pawn, a beautiful vessel meant to carry alliances, children, and royal expectations until her body gave out. Others argue she was more than that. A woman who understood her place on the board, yes, but who moved her own pieces when she could. Someone who wrote letters that still shimmer with quiet resistance, who raised children under impossible expectations, and who endured public humiliation with courtly grace. There's a strange silence around Isabella's name. No great wars bear her stamp. No famous portraits hang with her gaze. She isn't taught in classrooms or praised in documentaries. And yet her DNA continued, through her children, her grandchildren, and beyond. Her blood helped shape Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe for a time. Her lineage would bend into Philip II, and then eventually into the tragic silhouette of Charles II, the final gasp of Habsburg Spain. You can almost imagine her ghost in the hallways of Kronborg Castle or some Danish winter chapel, drifting between frost-rimed pillars with a look of quiet exhaustion. Maybe she's holding a letter from her mother. Maybe she's just whispering Latin prayers under her breath, the language of the Church of Power of Queens who didn't get to choose their lives. One quirky footnote to all this. After Isabella's death, Christian II would go into political exile. He lost his throne, fled across Europe, and tried unsuccessfully to regain power. In the end, he lived out his days under house arrest, pacing through rooms with flaking plaster and muttering about betrayal. But he kept a small portrait of Isabella near his bed. Whether out of guilt, love, or superstition, no one could say. There's a sadness that clings to Isabella's story, not just because she died young, but because her life was always framed by what she could produce, not who she was. And that sadness, gentle, quiet, and deeply human, will echo through so many of the women we'll meet tonight. Because Isabella wasn't the beginning or the end. She was just one step in a centuries-long experiment. And now it's time to meet the woman who gave birth to that experiment. A queen locked in a castle accused of madness, whose heart broke open so wide that history couldn't decide whether to pity her or fear her. You know her name? Joanna of Castile. Wait in the next room. Joanna of Castile has long been known by a name that feels more like a diagnosis than a title, Joanna the Mad. But madness, like beauty, is often defined by the people who write the stories. And in Joanna's case, the story was written by king's priests and power-hungry men who found it more convenient to say she was insane than to admit they were afraid of what she might do with a crown. She was born in 1479 to the most powerful couple in Spain, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs. Their marriage united Spain under one rule, launched the Inquisition, and funded a certain Genoese sailor named Columbus. They were a power couple before that was a phrase. And they had big plans for their children. Joanna was their third child, sandwiched between siblings who would inherit kingdoms or become saints. From an early age, she was devout, serious, and frighteningly intelligent. Her tutors wrote that she asked questions beyond the comfort of men. That's not a compliment, it's a warning. Even as a child, she seemed too aware, too observant. And in royal courts, especially for daughters, too much mind could be a dangerous thing. At 16, Joanna was married off to Philip the Handsome. Yes, that was literally his nickname. A Habsburg prince from the Austrian side of the family. His father was the Holy Roman Emperor, and his mother, Mary of Burgundy, had made him one of the most eligible bachelors in Europe. This was a strategic union designed to strengthen ties between Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and against all expectations, it was hot. Joanna and Philip fell for each other intensely, passionately, obsessively, at least at first. The kind of courtship that made onlookers squirm a little. Philip was handsome, charming, and acutely aware of both. Joanna was brilliant, emotional, and very much in love. Unfortunately, she was also deeply possessive, and Philip had a wandering eye. Once the infatuation wore off, Philip started doing what princes often did. He cheated. Openly, repeatedly, with courtier servants and ladies-in-waiting. Joanna's reactions were dramatic. She shouted. She threw things. Once, she allegedly attacked a lady-in-waiting with scissors for smiling too much at her husband. Court gossip spread like wildfire. Historians still debate whether Joanna's jealousy was a symptom of mental illness or the natural response of a teenage girl betrayed by the one person she truly loved. The 16th century diagnosis, hysteria. Of course, the male historians of the day found her emotional outburst terrifying and conveniently unfit for leadership. But then came the real twist. Joanna's mother died in 1504, making her Queen of Castile. On paper, she now held immense power. But Philip didn't like that. He wanted control, and so did her father Ferdinand. Both men declared Joanna unfit to rule. Suddenly, her grief, her fury, her heartache, they became political tools. Philip claimed she was insane. Ferdinand agreed. They said she was too emotional, too irrational, too dangerous to trust with the kingdom, and so began a long, slow, suffocating campaign to sideline her. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, some said from drinking cold water too fast, after playing ball, which is either medieval science or a very weak excuse Joanna's grief tipped into legend. She had his body embalmed, placed in a coffin, and refused to bury it. For years. She travelled with it across Castile, stopping at monasteries to pray for his soul, insisting he couldn't be laid to rest until they reached the proper place. Some say she opened the coffin periodically to gaze at him. Others say she wouldn't let any other woman near it, even nuns, for fear they might fall in love with his corpse. Yes, that part gets grim. But pause for a moment and ask, was this madness? Or was it a woman cracking under the unbearable pressure of betrayal loss, isolation, and public humiliation? Modern scholars offer different interpretations. Some suggest Joanna suffered from bipolar disorder. Others lean toward PTSD. A few believe she was simply caught in a brutal Game of Thrones, where her pain was manipulated into political justification. Because while Joanna was mourning, her father took over Castile. Then her son, future Emperor Charles V, kept her locked away in a convent for most of her remaining life. She was Queen of Castile for decades, but she signed nothing of importance. Her signature was used occasionally for legitimacy, like a wax seal, but she never ruled. She merely existed. Locked behind convent walls in Tordesillas, Joanna lived another 50 years. Her attendants were ordered not to talk politics with her. She was rarely allowed to see her children. Most of them died before she did far from her reach. Her son Charles visited her only once after he came of age. The boy she birthed into empire became one of the most powerful men in the world and kept his mother in the shadows. She died in 1555 at the age of 75 after nearly half a century in confinement. A prisoner, not just of stone walls, but of a story written by others. One odd fact: during her lifetime, several physicians believed her condition stemmed from a wandering womb, a theory that the uterus could travel through the body and cause hysteria when it reached the head. Yes, that was real medieval medical science. One doctor even recommended an exorcism. Because if you don't understand a woman's emotions clearly, it must be demons. So was Joanna truly mad, or was she a woman crushed by grief, betrayed by everyone she trusted, and stripped of her agency by a world that had no place for intelligent, emotional queens? Historians still debate the answer. But what's not debatable is this: Joanna's bloodline would echo across Europe for centuries. Her daughter Isabella, whom we met in the last section, inherited that same tangled DNA. Her grandson Charles V would rule half the known world. Her great-grandson Charles II would become the final broken piece of the Spanish Habsburg puzzle. Joanna was the hinge in the genetic door, the moment where the spiral truly began to turn inward. Her parents were cousins. Her husband was a cousin. Her children married cousins, and each generation drew tighter. And yet in the silence of her story, there's something unbreakable. A quiet dignity in the face of betrayal. A mother's love warped into myth. A queen remembered not for what she did, but for what they said she was. As the candles flicker low in her convent room, as the shadows stretch across the worn stone floor, you can almost hear her whispering in the dark. Not mad, not broken, just alone. And from her lineage, the next daughter would rise. Blonde, brilliant, and burdened once again with a bloodline already too closely stitched. She was Blanche of Castile, and she was next in line. Blanche of Castile came into the world with royal blood already looping in on itself like an embroidered cipher. Born in 1188, she was a walking treaty from the moment she took her first breath, a vessel for political peace wrapped in satin and duty. Her life would stretch across kingdoms, wars, and dynasties, but it all began with a marriage that was never meant to be hers. She was the daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England, which already tells you something important. Eleanor was the daughter of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, that Eleanor. The one who launched crusades, read Latin poetry, and was once locked in a tower by her own husband. So Blanche's maternal bloodline was already steeped in power ambition and a touch of chaos. And like many women in her family, Blanche was born to rule, but in the background with gloves on and lips sealed. Originally, the French crown had planned to marry Blanche's older sister Urraca to the heir of France. But in a last-minute switch, historians still squint at this one. Urraca was sent back and Blanche was chosen instead. Why the change? Some said Urraca showed signs of instability. Others murmured about her Castilian temperament, which was polite court speak, for she had opinions. Blanche, on the other hand, was quiet, observant, and most importantly, politically pliable. At the tender age of 12, Blanche was packed off to France to marry Louis, the son of King Philip II. A papal dispensation was quickly arranged. They were third cousins after all, and by 1200 she was officially the future Queen of France. At the wedding ceremony, guests praised her poise and grace, though one bishop reportedly noted she looked nervous and quite pale, which is probably the understatement of the century when you consider she'd just been married off to a foreign prince at an age when most kids today are learning long division. When Louis VIII became king in 1223, Blanche stepped into her role as queen consort with the quiet force of someone who had been training her whole life for this moment. But her most defining chapter came just 3 years later, when Louis died unexpectedly, leaving their 12-year-old son, the future St. Louis, as king. Suddenly, Blanche wasn't just queen, she was regent of France. Now, medieval regencies weren't exactly playgrounds for powerful women, but Blanche held her ground. She ruled with a velvet-covered iron will, drafting treaties, quelling rebellions, and keeping barons and bishops firmly in line. She navigated the treacherous waters of papal politics and royal succession without capsizing once. Even her critics admitted she was formidable, though they often added unwomanly for good measure, as if being competent somehow made her less of a lady. But beneath the polished surface of court diplomacy, the slow churn of genetics was already making itself known. Blanche and Louis were third cousins, which meant their children were born from a gene pool already a few inches too shallow. She bore 13 children, but only 5 survived infancy. That's a high mortality rate even for the 13th century. And of those survivors, several showed signs of frailty. One son had a pronounced curvature of the spine. Another suffered from seizures. Louis IX, her most famous child, was healthy enough to become king, and eventually a saint. But even he was said to suffer from chronic digestive issues and melancholia, that medieval catch-all that could mean anything from depression to Crohn's. Historians still debate whether these afflictions were due to inbreeding poor medieval hygiene or the psychological effects of growing up in a court where failure meant exile or worse. But the pattern kept repeating. Blanche's daughters were married off to other cousins and noble houses, stitching the same small network tighter and tighter. One of her granddaughters would eventually marry into the Habsburgs, and the wheel would keep turning. One particularly strange rumor followed Blanche throughout her life, that she was too close to her son, Louis IX. Some chroniclers whispered that she discouraged him from spending time with his wife Marguerite, and may have even manipulated their relationship. Others went further, suggesting an unnatural attachment. Most historians dismiss these claims as typical medieval misogyny. Powerful women were always accused of being either witches, seductresses, or emotionally unbalanced, but the rumor stuck a stain in the margins of her otherwise gleaming legacy. Still, the truth may be far simpler. Blanche had spent her life watching kings rise and fall. She knew that the throne was never secure, even when the crown fit. She'd lost children, navigated betrayals, and watched as her sisters were cast aside like broken chess pieces. Maybe she clung to her son because she knew deep down that the world would do everything it could to tear him away. Blanche ruled as regent again when Louis left for crusade. She managed the kingdom. In his absence, held court-issued edicts and quelled dissent. When she died in 1252, she left behind not just a stable France, but the foundations for what would become one of Europe's most deeply entangled dynastic networks. Through her children and grandchildren, Her blood touched nearly every major royal house in Western Europe, and yet she rarely appears in modern retellings, overshadowed by flashier queens forgotten by textbooks that favor warriors over whisperers. But Blanche of Castile was not just a quiet regent. She was a tactician, a stabilizer, a living hinge between two worlds, the fading Plantagenet order of her mother, Eleanor of England, and the rising Capetian dynasty of France. And through it all, she remained poised, diplomatic, and for the most part in control. One odd little fact: Blanche was one of the first queens in France to actively sponsor universities. She helped fund the early development of the University of Paris and supported monastic libraries. While barons plotted and knights clashed, she was quietly helping launch what would become the European intellectual renaissance. No big deal. But her real legacy wasn't books or laws. It was blood. Through calculated marriages and generational repetition, Blanche contributed to the tightening web of European royal inbreeding. Her grandchildren would marry cousins. Her great-grandchildren would double down. And by the time we reach the 16th century, her DNA would still be echoing through the fragile bones and anxious hearts of queens we've already met. So while Blanche may not be remembered as a tragic figure, her story hums with quiet tension. A girl chosen at the last minute, a mother who buried too many children, a regent who ruled without wearing the crown in her own name, and a grandmother of dynastic consolidation who set the table for what would centuries later become a genetic house of cards. And next we travel south into the Iberian Sun and the stone palaces of Portugal, where another young woman, Eleanor, would marry her own uncle and find herself trapped in a frigid empire of bureaucracy and broken promises. The family tree tightens again, and the roots are starting to twist. Eleanor of Portugal, also known as Leonor in her homeland, entered history, like so many royal women of her time, swaddled in tapestries passed between kingdoms like a warm diplomatic letter, and sealed into a marriage that was more genealogical strategy than personal choice. But Eleanor's story takes a sharper, colder turn than most, because when she married Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor, she wasn't just aligning thrones, she was marrying her own uncle. Literally. Let's untangle that. Eleanor was born in 1434 to King Duarte of Portugal and Eleanor of Aragon. Already the bloodlines were starting to knit a little too tightly. Her parents were cousins from the Trastamara and Aragonese houses families that had been interweaving for generations, and as Eleanor grew, the expectations around her did too. She was beautiful, well-educated, and devout, all excellent qualities for a bride. But none of that would matter as much as her name and her blood, because what Eleanor represented more than charm or piety was an unbroken line of royal legitimacy, and to the Habsburgs that meant everything. In 1452, at just 17 years old, Eleanor was sent from sun-washed Lisbon to the Holy Roman Empire to marry Frederick III. He was 37, meticulous, politically cautious, and yes, her mother's brother, which makes him Eleanor's maternal uncle. That's not a nickname. That's biology. Even by medieval standards, this was eyebrow-raising, but with the right papal paperwork dispensations for consanguinity were basically royal, get-out-of-incest-free cards. It was all made legal. And the motivations were, as usual, strategic. The Habsburgs wanted to secure their claim to the imperial crown. Portugal wanted deeper influence in Central Europe. The niece and the uncle were just two faces on a well-lit chessboard. The wedding took place in Siena after months of delays. Frederick was reportedly so hesitant that he considered backing out entirely. He had never met Eleanor until the day of the ceremony, and when he finally saw her, his first recorded words were, "She is prettier than her portrait," which in royal marriage terms is high praise. But whatever relief Eleanor might have felt at that small mercy would soon wither. The Holy Roman Court was a cold place, literally and emotionally. Eleanor, raised in Portugal's vibrant, artistically rich courts, found herself in a political machine obsessed with finance tradition and tight-lipped diplomacy. Frederick was conservative dull by most accounts and spent most of his time doing things like reorganizing imperial revenue or counting coinage. Eleanor once allegedly remarked that her husband preferred his ledgers to his wife. Ouch. She was deeply homesick. The food was strange, the climate was harsh, the court etiquette was suffocating, and as if that weren't enough, the man she now shared a bed with had the same nose as her mother. Their marriage was never a passionate one, but it did fulfill its most important duty. They had 5 children. 3 survived infancy, including Maximilian the First, who would go on to become one of the most powerful emperors in European history, and marry, of course, another cousin. Maximilian inherited the Habsburg jaw, that now famous mandibular trait that would later become symbolic of the entire family's slow genetic decline. He also inherited a knack for empire building, but we'll get to him another night. As for Eleanor, her health deteriorated steadily. The cold winters wore her down. The pregnancies, closely spaced and physically taxing, took their toll. She suffered chronic fatigue, what physicians called nervous weakness, and mysterious illnesses that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. Some historians suspect porphyria, a hereditary blood disorder. Others lean toward lupus or another autoimmune condition. But regardless of the diagnosis, the result was the same: a woman born into power, slowly fading in the background, drained by politics, childbirth, and isolation. There's a particularly heartbreaking detail that comes through in her letters, because Eleanor, unlike many queens of her era, left behind her own voice. Letters to her brother King Alfonso III of Portugal reveal deep loneliness. She complains of the cold, of feeling like a stranger, of missing music and sunlight and laughter. She writes about her longing for familiar languages, for the warm stone of Lisbon's palaces, and she hints gently at her marriage, at feeling unseen, at being used. Frederick, for his part, seemed more attached to his paperwork than to his wife. When Eleanor died in 1467, at just 32 years old, Frederick didn't attend her funeral. He claimed he was busy with court affairs. Historians still debate whether he grieved privately or whether he simply saw her death as another item on a long to-do list. But the symbolism remains brutal. The emperor who had married his own niece couldn't be bothered to say goodbye. One strange little fact: Eleanor had a fascination with relics and saints. She collected fragments of bone and cloth, prayed constantly, and was rumored to sleep with a piece of the true cross under her pillow. Was it pure faith, or perhaps a quiet coping mechanism, something to hold on to while everything else slipped away? What we do know is that her influence didn't die with her. Through Maximilian, her bloodline extended into every major court in Europe. Her grandchildren would marry each other again and again, and the spiral she helped turn would keep tightening. Because while Eleanor didn't start the Habsburg inbreeding crisis, she helped shape the structure it would follow. The niece-uncle marriage created a precedent, or perhaps just reinforced an existing one, that royal blood was worth more than biology, and that women could be married off like building blocks, even if the architecture started to crack. And Eleanor's cracks were visible in her letters, in her decline, in the child whose jaw would become legend. She wasn't mad like Joanna. She wasn't iron-willed like Blanche. She was something softer, sadder, and somehow more human. A romantic forced into cold logic, a songbird in an abacus. And yet she played her part. She bore heirs. She legitimized alliances. She carried the Habsburg name into a new century. But her voice, when you read it, is what lingers. Not her face in a portrait or her crown in a glass case. Her voice. Low, quiet, distant like a woman praying in a foreign tongue beneath an unfamiliar sky. Next, we step forward to meet one of Eleanor's most determined descendants. A woman who didn't just survive the system, but reshaped it. Margaret of Austria is waiting, and she's ready to play the game better than anyone expected. Margaret of Austria was born into a tangle of velvet banners and betrothal documents. From her first breath in 1480, she was not so much a child as she was a promise, packaged and dispatched across Europe as the glue for a dozen uneasy alliances. She would be handed from court to court, dressed in the finest gowns, taught the finest manners, and offered up like a sacrament at the altar of dynastic peace. But unlike so many other women in her family tree, Margaret wasn't content to be just another silent node in the Habsburg web. She was going to rule it, or at the very least survive it on her own terms. Let's start at the center of her identity, her bloodline. Margaret was the daughter of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, yes, the same Maximilian who inherited the beginnings of the infamous Habsburg jaw from his mother Eleanor of Portugal. Her mother, Mary of Burgundy, died in a tragic riding accident when Margaret was only 2, leaving her an heiress in theory, but a political pawn in practice. From the very beginning, Margaret was marked for marriage. At the tender age of 33, she was betrothed to Charles, the future King of France. She was promptly sent to the French court to be raised as the future Queen of France. Her childhood was conducted in a foreign tongue, in a foreign land, among people who smiled at her like she was an antique vase they hoped wouldn't crack. By the time she was 10, she was fluent in French, played the lute, quoted Latin poets, and knew exactly when to curtsy and when to look demure. And then, just as the wedding neared, France changed its mind. Charles married someone else, Anne of Brittany, for political reasons. Margaret, barely a teenager, was sent back to her father like damaged goods. It's a moment that would break many girls, but not Margaret. Instead, she used the rejection as armor. The next time she was offered in marriage, this time to John, Prince of Asturias and heir to the Spanish throne, she accepted with icy grace. John was, of course, her cousin. Several times over, in fact, as both the Habsburg and Trastamara lines had been intertwining for generations, the wedding was short-lived. John died within 6 months. Some blamed tuberculosis. Others whispered about poison. Still others suggested that John simply didn't have the constitution to survive the union of so much shared DNA. Margaret, now twice betrothed and once widowed before the age of 20, might have disappeared into a nunnery or a shadowy dowagerhood. But she didn't. She returned to the Habsburg court and began to rebuild herself, not as a bride, but as a political actor. Her father Maximilian saw her potential and appointed her to govern the Netherlands on behalf of her nephew Charles, who would later become Charles I, ruler of the Spanish Empire and Holy Roman Emperor. And this is where Margaret shines. As governor of the Netherlands, Margaret didn't just hold court, she ran it. She negotiated with France, Spain, and England. She quelled uprisings, balanced trade, and coordinated the sprawling economic engine of the Low Countries. She commissioned palaces and sponsored scholars. She wrote letters to Erasmus, exchanged views with Thomas More, and edited her own political speeches. Ambassadors from rival kingdoms treated her with the same respect they would a king. And yet the family web was never far behind. Margaret was still deeply embedded in the dynastic machine. Her siblings, her nieces, her cousins, nearly all of them were marrying each other. Her brother Philip the Handsome married Joanna of Castile, her cousin. Their children, including Charles I, were the concentrated product of generations of first cousin marriages. Margaret saw what this was doing. She wasn't blind to the consequences. Her own nephews and nieces suffered from fragile health, strange afflictions, and unpredictable behavior. But what choice did she have? The political calculus hadn't changed. Marrying outsiders meant risking legitimacy. Marrying within meant preserving power. One niece, Eleanor of Austria, married the King of Portugal, her double first cousin. Another, Catherine of Austria, married King John III of Portugal, also a double cousin. Margaret arranged many of these marriages herself. She didn't flinch. She just made sure the treaties were in order, the portraits painted, the ships loaded with dowries. But in her personal life, Margaret made a quiet rebellion. She never remarried. Despite pressure, despite political expedients, despite whispers from her court, Margaret stayed single. Whether this was from grief strategy or sheer exhaustion, we don't know. Historians still debate whether she remained faithful to her first husband or simply chose power over vulnerability. But what is certain is that her choice gave her freedom, and she used it well. She surrounded herself with books, tapestries, and one famously moody monkey named Barb. She collected art, commissioned altarpieces, and kept an extensive wardrobe that included gowns so heavy with embroidery that they required assistance just to stand still. But beneath the luxury, she was always calculating, always watching. One odd fact, Margaret was so meticulous in her management of court affairs that she kept a coded notebook detailing which ambassadors brought better gifts and which ones were more likely to lie. It was less a diary than a soft-spoken surveillance log. When she died in 1530 at the age of 50, it was from complications after stepping on a nail. Yes, a nail. Tetanus, they suspect. Tetanus, a brutal irony for a woman who had outlasted political exiles, broken engagements, and royal tragedy only to be undone by a sliver of iron in a palace corridor. Her death was mourned deeply. Erasmus, the great humanist, wrote that Europe had lost one of its finest minds, not one of its finest women, but minds. High praise in an age where female intelligence was often treated as a liability. Margaret's legacy is a strange one. She was both a participant in the inbreeding system and a quiet critic of it. She arranged the very marriages that further twisted the Habsburg family tree, but she also protected the children, negotiated their futures, and gave them something close to stability. She walked the tightrope of dynasty and dignity with remarkable poise, and perhaps most remarkable of all, she left no children, no descendants, no DNA to carry forward. In a family obsessed with bloodlines, she chose to end hers. The rest of the family they carried on. Cousin married cousin. Uncles married nieces. The spiral kept tightening. And the child of one of her arranged matches, Catherine of Aragon, would become Queen of England. Next, we follow that thread across the channel to England, where Catherine herself, a Habsburg grandchild, would face 6 pregnancies, one infamous king, and a theological firestorm that would burn through centuries. The bloodline continues, but the body begins to break. Catherine of Aragon was born into the golden age of Spanish, might swaddled in Catholic splendor and the heavy weight of dynastic purpose. Her parents were none other than Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the same monarchs who drove out the last Moorish rulers from Granada, unified Spain, and sponsored a certain Italian sailor named Columbus. Catherine was their youngest daughter, their final ribbon of legacy, their most malleable diplomatic tool. And like so many royal daughters before her, she was raised not for a quiet life, but for marriage. Her future was determined when she was just 3 years old. The plan was simple: unite Spain and England, so Catherine was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of Henry VII. At age 15, she left the blazing sun of Spain for the damp mists of Tudor England. Her wedding to Arthur was extravagant, a celebration of alliance power and the careful interweaving of Catholic houses. The marriage was brief. Arthur died just 5 months later, possibly from the sweating sickness, possibly from tuberculosis, possibly just from being young and unlucky in a damp castle with questionable sanitation. He was 15. Catherine was left a widow in a country that didn't quite know what to do with her, and a dowry only half paid. And here, the story takes one of its many turns. Rather than send Catherine back to Spain, Henry VII proposed something unusual: she should marry Arthur's younger brother Henry. That Henry, the one who would become Henry VIII, the man of 6 wives, the breaker of England's bond with Rome, and eventually the architect of Catherine's public humiliation. But there was a problem. Marrying your dead husband's brother was against church law. canonical incest technically, but Catherine insisted adamantly, repeatedly, and under oath that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She was in the eyes of God still a virgin. The Pope agreed. A papal dispensation was granted. The wedding went forward. And for a time things looked fine. Catherine was adored by the English people. She was pious, intelligent, fluent in Latin, and fiercely diplomatic. She played the role of queen with grace. When Henry VIII went off to fight in France, she served as regent and presided over the stunning English victory at the Battle of Flodden against Scotland. She was, by all accounts, competent and respected. But beneath the glittering surface of pearls and ceremony, the Habsburg bloodline was beginning to falter. Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times. Only one child survived, a daughter Mary, who would later become the first queen regnant of England. The rest, boys and girls, were stillborn, miscarried, or died in infancy. One baby boy lived for only a few weeks. Each loss was a public event. Each funeral another silent indictment of her womb. And slowly Henry began to turn. At first there were prayers, then frustration, then theological doubts. He began to wonder, was this God's punishment for his sinful marriage? Had the papal dispensation been invalid? Had he condemned his reign by marrying his brother's widow? It's here that modern science raises a chilling theory. Historians and geneticists alike have noted that Catherine's ancestry, like so many others in her family, was densely interwoven. Her parents Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins. Their lineage stemmed from the Trastamara dynasty, which had intermarried with Portuguese, French, and Burgundian houses for centuries. Catherine therefore carried multiple layers of inbreeding. Some researchers now suspect she may have had a rare blood antigen, a condition known as Kell alloimmunization. If Catherine was Kell positive and Henry was Kell negative, the first pregnancy might have succeeded, but her immune system would attack subsequent Kell positive fetuses. It's just a theory, and historians still debate whether it applies, but it adds a haunting modern gloss to her repeated losses. Of course, no one in the 16th century could explain it that way. Instead, Catherine was blamed, quietly at first, then openly. Her body had failed, her blood had failed, and Henry, desperate for a male heir, began looking elsewhere. Enter Anne Boleyn. Henry's obsession with Anne and her refusal to be his mistress coincided with his decision to seek an annulment from Catherine. He argued that their marriage had never been valid, that her union with Arthur had been consummated, and that no papal bull could overwrite divine law. Catherine refused. To the end, she insisted she was Henry's lawful wife. She would not step aside. She would not confess to a sin she hadn't committed. Even as Henry stripped her of her title, moved her into remote castles, and barred her from seeing her daughter Catherine, held her ground. She spent her final years at Kimbolton Castle, isolate, ill, and still dignified. She wrote letters to her nephew Emperor Charles V begging for support. She embroidered, she prayed, and she died in 1536 at age 50, likely from cancer. Her last letter to Henry addressed him not as a tyrant or a monster, but as my most dear lord and husband. A quiet end to a life shaped by obedience, faith, and loss. A quirky fact, Catherine was a voracious reader. She translated devotional texts from Latin to Spanish and was a patron of Erasmus, the great humanist. Even while banished, she kept a small library by her bedside. Books were her companions when the court had turned against her. And her daughter Mary. She would grow up to become Mary I of England, later known as Bloody Mary, and her own marriage would once again loop the bloodlines. She married Philip II of Spain, her cousin. So what remains of Catherine, a story of strength wrapped in sorrow, a woman who never broke even when the world stripped her of everything. She bore the cost of her family's genetic ambition in her body, in her children's graves, in her quiet suffering. And she never stopped believing that her role, her marriage, her faith had been righteous. Historians still debate whether her failure to produce a male heir was biological fate or divine irony, whether she was tragically unlucky or the predictable outcome of centuries of bloodline repetition. But the pain was real. The tombs are real. And next we return to Spain, to a palace warmed by incense and heavy with duty. There Catherine's niece Isabella of Portugal awaits, and she's about to marry her own double first cousin, because the spiral, it isn't slowing down, it's getting tighter. Isabella of Portugal was born into a dynasty that knew only one direction inward. Her parents were Manuel I of Portugal and Maria of Aragon, both thick with royal blood, both heirs to the sprawling ambitions of Iberian Empire, and crucially both descended from the same Trastamara stock that had already begun to spiral into itself like an overworked family crest. If you remember Catherine of Aragon, you'll remember the names. Maria of Aragon was Catherine's sister, making Isabella her niece. And when Isabella came of age, she married Charles V, Catherine's nephew, which meant, if you're keeping score, that Charles was both her cousin and her double first cousin. Let that echo for a moment. A double first cousin marriage means that the bride and groom's mothers were sisters and their fathers were brothers. That's not just close, it's microscopic. Their genetic makeup was so similar, they could have worn matching chromosomes to the wedding. But of course, the union was about far more than blood. Charles V was the most powerful man in Europe at the time. He ruled not just Spain, but also large parts of Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, and the Americas. He was emperor and king warrior and administrator, perpetually hunched over maps and muttering about Protestant rebellions. And he needed a wife who would bring both legitimacy and loyalty. There were plenty of eligible princesses across Europe, but in the end he chose Isabella. Why? Because she was a Habsburg twice over. Their wedding in 1526 was grand by any standard festivals. Parades, banquet halls groaning with silver and sugar. There were embroidered gloves, gold-threaded saddlecloths, and enough incense to choke a cathedral. Charles, famously stern and somber, was reportedly smitten. And by all accounts, the affection was mutual, which is rare in these stories. They genuinely loved each other, and that might be what makes this chapter even harder to tell. Because love here wasn't enough to hold off what centuries of cousin matching had already begun to unravel. Isabella gave birth to 7 children. Only 3 survived infancy. The rest were stillborn or died within weeks. The most famous of her children was Philip II of Spain, the very man who would go on to marry Mary Tudor, his cousin, and later his niece. But we're not quite there yet. Let's stay with Isabella. She was a woman of immense poise. Intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, raised in the elaborate etiquette of Portuguese court life, but she wasn't a showpiece. While Charles campaigned across Europe, chasing Lutherans, appeasing popes, juggling wars, Isabella served as regent in Spain. She oversaw taxation, managed grain distribution, coordinated military provisioning, and maintained order in a country that was, quite frankly, fraying at the seams. Her correspondence with Charles is still studied. Not because it's romantic, though, sometimes it is, but because it reads like dispatches between 2 heads of state. She informed him of local revolts. She debated with him over policy. She sent recommendations for court appointments and even chided him gently when he ignored her advice. One odd but telling anecdote, Isabella once collapsed during a public procession while pregnant. She fainted in front of an entire cathedral audience, the candlelight catching her pale face as she was rushed from the platform. She never fully recovered from that pregnancy. Within the year she was dead. She was 36. The cause? Complications from childbirth. Of course, that vague umbrella term that hides a multitude of sins, hemorrhage, infection, organ failure, or perhaps just a body worn down by genetic fragility and relentless expectation. Charles was devastated. He wore black for the rest of his life. He commissioned endless portraits of Isabella sculpted in marble, painted in oil, her serene face immortalized in chapel corners and private halls. He refused to remarry, and in his later years, after abdicating his thrones, Charles retired to a monastery where he spent his days tinkering with clocks. A man who once ruled half the known world ended his life trying to make time move precisely, and maybe trying to rewind it. Historians still debate how much Isabella understood about the dangers of her marriage. Probably not much in modern terms. She didn't know the phrase recessive gene, but she knew her family. She knew the stories. She attended the funerals. She buried children. And she watched as her surviving son Philip began to show signs of the dynasty's slow unraveling. Intelligent but somber. Devout to the point of obsession. Often rigid. Often ill. One quirky detail: Isabella was deeply interested in religious relics. Like her Aunt Eleanor, she collected them, bones of saints, shreds of veils, drops of holy blood sealed in crystal. One report said her private chapel looked more like a reliquary vault than a sanctuary. Was it devotion, or the need for divine protection in a world where even royal blood couldn't save your babies? In the end, Isabella became more than a queen. She became an inflection point. Her marriage to Charles V marked the moment the Habsburg bloodline turned from strategy to surrender. After Isabella, there were so few outside royals left to marry who still matched the family's idea of nobility, piety, and political convenience that they simply gave up looking. From that point on, most marriages within the dynasty became echo chambers. Cousins, uncles, nieces. The spiral, already tight, became suffocating. And yet Isabella's legacy lasted. Through Philip II, through his children, through his disastrous marriage to his niece Anna of Austria, through portraits of boys with sunken chests and jaws that jutted like boat prows, through generations of daughters who bled out in birthing chambers while tapestries fluttered in the heat. Isabella is often forgotten beside louder names, Catherine, Charles, Philip, but she is the quiet spine of a collapsing empire. The woman who ran a kingdom, raised an heir, and loved her husband, even when that husband shared the same set of grandparents on both sides. Next we meet one of the most tragic continuations of her line. Philip's marriage to Anna of Austria was not just another Habsburg match, it was the genetic point of no return. And the woman at the heart of it, she was his niece, and she carried in her womb the future king who would be hollowed behind the crown. Anna of Austria was born into a dynasty already groaning under the weight of its own legacy. A Habsburg by blood, a Habsburg by name, and eventually a Habsburg by marriage, Anna didn't enter the family. She was never outside it to begin with. By the time she was old enough to walk her place in the genetic echo chamber of Europe's most overbred dynasty had already been determined. Born in 1549 to Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, Anna's pedigree was impeccable and almost uncomfortably symmetrical. Her father Maximilian was the Holy Roman Emperor. Her mother Maria was the daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. Yes, the couple we just met. That made Maria both Maximilian's cousin and critically the niece of her own husband's mother. If that sentence gave you pause, congratulations, your instincts are working. Anna's parents were not just cousins. They were genetically woven from the same loop of royal rope that had been tightening for generations. And when Anna grew up, she married Philip II of Spain, her uncle. Let's pause there. Philip II was her mother's brother, making Anna his biological niece. Not just cousin in the medieval sense where distant branches sometimes rubbed elbows. No, Philip had held Anna as a child. He had bounced her on his lap, received her letters, attended her christening. And in 1570, when he was 43 and she was 17, he married her. The Pope, as usual, granted a dispensation. Because of course he did. It wasn't even considered scandalous by court standards. If anything, it was efficient. Why go shopping for a queen outside the family when you could just select one from your own bloodline, ensure her loyalty, and keep the property and chromosomes firmly in the family vault? And so the wedding went forward. The Spanish court was cloaked in black and gold. Anna arrived dressed like a dove, quiet and obedient, with wide eyes and a collection of holy relics wrapped in linen. Philip was on his fourth marriage. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his double first cousin. Their child, Don Carlos, was so unstable that he was eventually imprisoned by Philip himself. His second wife was Mary Tudor of England, Catherine of Aragon's daughter and Philip's cousin. His third, Elizabeth of Valois, had died young, also a cousin. By the time Anna became queen, the Habsburg gene pool had turned into something more like a fountain, decorative, recirculating, and very shallow. And yet Anna and Philip had a surprisingly peaceful marriage. She was kind, quiet, devout, exactly what the Spanish court required in a queen. Philip, deeply religious and increasingly melancholic, seemed to appreciate her steadiness. There were no grand scandals, no lovers, no dramatic breakdowns, just silence, ritual, and duty. But underneath the composure, the bloodline was beginning to buckle. Anna and Philip had 5 children. 4 survived infancy, which was nearly miraculous. One of them, Philip III, would become king, but even among the surviving heirs, the cracks were showing. Philip III was listless, indecisive, and deeply dependent on advisors. As a king, he was more decorative than directive, letting his favorites, especially the Duke of Lerma, run the country while he attended mass and commissioned churches. His reign marked the beginning of Spain's slow descent from power. Historians still debate whether his passivity was personal or hereditary, whether he was simply a pious man uninterested in politics, or the product of too many generations of cousin marriage where the intellectual sharpness and political savvy of earlier rulers had given way to apathy and dysfunction. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Anna, like many Habsburg queens, suffered quietly. The pregnancies came in quick succession, each one heavier than the last. Her letters, few survive, mention fatigue, headaches, and fainting spells. One contemporary chronicler noted that she was frequently overcome by the weight of the day and the weight of the child within her. Her spiritual director advised her to embrace suffering as purification. She did. She died in 1580, just shy of her 31st birthday, from complications related to childbirth. Philip was devastated, for a man who had buried 3 wives before her Anna's death left a particularly deep mark. He wore mourning clothes for the rest of his life. He kept her portraits in his chambers. Some said he whispered to her image in the candlelight, seeking her intercession. He never remarried. But while Philip mourned in private, the consequences of their union were increasingly public. Their children carried forward an even more concentrated Habsburg inheritance, recessive traits stacking atop each other like cards in a doomed game. Physical deformities, mood disorders, immune deficiencies. One of their daughters died, young another never married. And Philip III, as we'll see, ruled with a kind of holy passivity that left Spain vulnerable to corruption and decay. One strange footnote, Anna was obsessed with relics. She collected hundreds, fragments of saints' bones, cloth stained with sacred oil, tiny splinters said to be from the cross. Her personal chapel was so dense with these objects that it was referred to as a forest of holy death. Some say she believed the relics protected her children from the curse of their blood. Others say she simply did what all Habsburg queens were taught to do, suffer, pray, and hope. And maybe she did protect them for a time. But the accumulation of broken chromosomes doesn't stop because someone lights another candle. Anna's life is often passed over because it lacked drama. She wasn't mad like Joanna, nor iron-willed like Blanche, nor politically sharp like Margaret. She was soft-edged, dutiful, and devout. But that softness carried a danger all its own. She was the quiet midwife of a generational collapse, because from her womb came Philip III, and from his eventually came the most tragic Habsburg of them all, Charles II of Spain. But before we reach the final unraveling, we turn to another woman, Anna's sister-in-law, a woman who ruled in her own name, who managed regencies and councils, who was clever and composed and who, despite all her competence, still couldn't outrun the spiral. Juana of Austria is waiting in the next candlelit corridor. And she's about to do something almost unheard of for a Habsburg woman governed with her own name at the top of the page. Juana of Austria was born into one of the most constricting dynasties in European history, and yet somehow she managed to breathe. Among a long line of women whose worth was measured in wombs and whose futures were drawn up on parchment before their baby teeth had fallen out, Juana carved out a sliver of autonomy. She was regal intelligent and by some miracle allowed to rule, if only briefly. But even she couldn't fully escape the gravitational pull of her family's spiraling genetics and the expectations that came with a name like Habsburg. She was born in 1535, daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. If you're keeping track, that makes her the child of double first cousins. Her bloodline by that point was so tight, it could have been bottled and sold as concentrate. Charles and Isabella were, as we've seen, devoted to each other, but their love didn't lessen the fact that Juana's genetic inheritance was an echo chamber. Still from her earliest days, Juana impressed. She was raised in the heart of the Spanish court, surrounded by priests, tutors, relics, and silence. She was taught Latin theology, philosophy, and the Habsburg version of emotional self-erasure. At 14, she was fluent in multiple languages. She had the gaze of a statue and the composure of someone who already knew her life wouldn't belong to her. By 17, she was married. Of course. Her husband was João Manuel of Portugal, her first cousin naturally. He was sickly pale and carried the same tangled blood as Juana. Their union was meant to tighten the Iberian knot between Spain and Portugal. The marriage lasted just over a year. João died in 1554, likely of tuberculosis or the general weakness that plagued so many royals whose ancestors kept appearing on both sides of their family tree. But not before Juana became pregnant. She gave birth to a son Sebastian, who would become King of Portugal. Then instead of staying in Portugal to raise her infant heir, Juana returned to Spain. Historians still argue about that decision. Was it forced, voluntary? Did she leave because she was no longer politically necessary in Lisbon, or because she saw a chance, however brief, to reassert control over her own life? Whatever the reason, Juana left her newborn behind and went home. And there's something unusual happened. Her brother Philip II, the same Philip who married their niece Anna of Austria, appointed her regent of Spain. Yes, a woman, a Habsburg woman in the 16th century, governing Spain. For several years, Juana presided over the Spanish court, while Philip was away in England wooing Queen Mary Tudor. She attended council meetings, issued decrees, oversaw taxation, and managed foreign policy. And she did it all with the same composure she had been trained to wield since childhood. Ministers came to respect her, ambassadors reported on her judgment, and though her name never quite made it into the grand historical paintings, she was during her regency the de facto ruler of Spain. Then she disappeared. Not literally. But once Philip returned, Juana quietly retired from court life. In 1559, at the age of 24, she entered the convent of Las Descalzas Reales in Madrid. It had been founded by Juana herself. She didn't go there as a nun in the traditional sense. She didn't take full vows. Instead, she became a religious resident living within the walls of the cloister, but maintaining control over her own household, her finances, and her political connections. This wasn't a retreat. It was a maneuver. In a world that offered her marriage or oblivion, Juana had carved out a third path. She stayed unmarried, avoided being handed off to another cousin, and lived out her days in a palace disguised as a convent. Her suite was filled with artworks, diplomatic correspondence, and relics. The Descalzas became a haven for other royal women, a place where faith and quiet power could coexist. Still, she never saw her son again. Sebastian remained in Portugal, raised by regents and priests. As a child, he was pious, rigid, and consumed with the idea of becoming a holy warrior. He refused to marry, He refused to produce heirs. He obsessed over crusades and martyrdom. In 1578, at the age of 24, the same age Juana had entered the convent, Sebastian launched a disastrous military campaign in North Africa. He died in battle. His body was never recovered. His death triggered a succession crisis that led to the absorption of Portugal into the Spanish Empire under Juana's brother Philip II. Her legacy, once so promising, ended in silence. Historians still debate Juana's motivations. Was she a woman of faith or of quiet rebellion? Did she choose the convent out of devotion, or was it the only acceptable way to avoid another dynastic trap? One odd fact that emerges from court gossip: Juana never raised her voice. Not once. Not during her regency. Not during debates. Not during ceremonies. Ministers reportedly feared her gaze more than a king's temper. There's even an apocryphal story that during one council meeting, a room full of bickering men fell silent when Juana simply raised an eyebrow. A Habsburg trick, perhaps. She had seen too much. Her mother had died from childbirth. Her father had abdicated into a monastery. Her brother had married their niece. Her son had died in a crusade no one wanted. And through it all, Juana remained poised, distant, and unbroken. She died in 1573 at the age of 38, officially of natural causes, but unofficially perhaps of weariness, of silence, of holding together a lineage that was already fraying at the edges. Because even Juana, with her intelligence and serenity, couldn't halt what was coming. Her family line would continue to twist inward. The children of her brother Philip and their niece Anna would inherit not just kingdoms but tremors in the blood, mouths that couldn't close, minds that drifted, empires that cracked under the weight of centuries of folded genes. And next, we turn to a woman who ruled in the north, far from the Iberian courts, but never far from the Habsburg name. Her name was Isabella Clara Eugenia, and she might have been the last bright candle before the darkness fully set in. Isabella Clara Eugenia entered the world in 1566, a time when the Spanish court smelled of incense, old velvet, and carefully rationed optimism. The child of Philip II and Anna of Austria, uncle and niece, she was the product of one of the closest consanguineous marriages in recorded Habsburg history. If you were to graph her family tree, it wouldn't look like a tree at all. It would look like a loop of gold thread, knotted again and again, curling into itself until the ends were indistinguishable. And yet, against all odds, Isabella Clara Eugenia was by Habsburg standards healthy, whole, cognitively sharp, physically stable, a small miracle in a dynasty that had begun producing children like glassware, fragile, lopsided, and often broken before adulthood. Philip adored her. She was his first surviving child from his fourth marriage, and he reportedly doted on her with the soft precision of a man trying not to acknowledge that 3 of his other marriages had ended in sorrow. Unlike many of his sons who struggled under the weight of expectation, Isabella rose to meet it. She was intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply pious, an expected trait in Habsburg daughters, but one she seemed to embrace with genuine fervor rather than obligation. Her education was rigorous: Latin, French, Spanish, theology, law, and diplomacy. She could translate Cicero in the morning and draft a letter to the Pope by afternoon. Her tutors reported that she had the mind of a magistrate and the heart of a monk. In a family where most daughters were expected to marry cousins and die in childbirth, Isabella was being groomed for something else: a throne. In 1598, Philip, aging, widowed, and surrounded by the fading remnants of empire, did something unusual. He granted Isabella and her husband, Archduke Albert of Austria, joint rule over the Spanish Netherlands, not as viceroys, not as ceremonial figureheads, as sovereigns. It was one of the rare instances in Habsburg history where a woman was handed real political power while still drawing breath. Albert, of course, was also her cousin. There were no other options by this point, but unlike many other royal marriages, theirs was functional, respectful, possibly even affectionate. They worked as a team. While Albert led the armies and managed the external threat, Protestant revolts, territorial disputes, Dutch independence, Isabella ruled the court of the cities and the fragile politics of the Catholic Low Countries. And she was good at it. She restored order to a region frayed by decades of religious war. She negotiated with the Protestant nobles, managed famine, relief, rebuilt infrastructure, and revitalized trade. The local nobility respected her. The clergy adored her. Even foreign ambassadors trained to downplay female rulers admitted she was formidable in silence. Still, the Habsburg inheritance wasn't far behind. Isabella and Albert tried but never managed to produce children. Whether by design or biology, no one could say. Some contemporary rumors whispered that Albert was sterile, his own ancestry not exactly unknotted. Others speculated that Isabella had suffered miscarriages hidden from public knowledge, but what is certain is that the couple remained childless. And with that, the line through Isabella came to an end, yet she ruled on. When Albert died in 1621, Isabella took religious vows and became a nun technically, but in practice she continued governing the Spanish Netherlands as its sole sovereign. She wore the habit of the poor Clares, yes, but her chamber still rang with council meetings and diplomatic audiences. She simply traded court silks for black wool and kept the gears of governance turning beneath the veil. Her rule, especially after Albert's death, became an exercise in quiet mastery. No drama, no scandals, just methodical, effective statecraft. She reorganized municipal governments, mediated tensions between Catholic factions, and ensured that taxes were collected with minimal revolt. All of it while maintaining an image of spiritual sanctity. Historians still debate how much autonomy she truly had. Was she acting on her own will or merely executing her father's final wishes and her brother's instructions? But the fact remains, she ruled competently for over 2 decades in a part of Europe that had eaten lesser men alive. A quirky, lesser-known detail, Isabella loved theater. Not as passive entertainment, but as an active patron. She read scripts, attended rehearsals, and even acted in court morality plays as a young woman. In one recorded performance, she played the Virgin Mary with such solemnity that several courtiers reportedly wept. She believed deeply in the power of sacred art to mold morality, and her court reflected that, filled with painters, musicians, and poets crafting their way through counter-Reformation piety. And yet behind the veil and incense, the Habsburg genetics continued to whisper. Though Isabella had escaped the worst of her bloodline's inheritance, the family around her was crumbling. Her cousins suffered from recurring fevers, bleeding disorders, infertility, and bouts of depression so severe that letters had to be dictated by attendants. Children born from increasingly tight, consanguineous pairings were arriving into the world with underbites so severe they couldn't nurse. Young nobles died before their betrothals were finalized. The dynastic machine was still running, but the wheels were starting to grind. Isabella saw it all. She had arranged many of the marriages herself, carefully, diplomatically, hoping that love or at least stability might bloom from them. But by her later years, she must have known the truth: the loop was too tight. The spiral had no way out. She died in 1633 at the age of 66, an astonishing lifespan for a Habsburg woman. Her funeral was a national event. Black-draped streets, eulogies delivered in 3 languages, bells tolling across Flanders and Brussels. People mourned her not as a lost heir or a forgotten bride, but as a leader, an actual sovereign. A rarity. She left no children, no dynastic legacy, no bloodline continuation, and maybe that was her final grace, because what came after her was darker. What followed was the final inward turn of the Habsburg spiral. The chin grew heavier, the minds grew quieter, the thrones grew emptier. But for a moment, for a flickering span of decades, Isabella Clara Eugenia had kept the flame alive, steady, thoughtful, almost free. And now we leave the disciplined halls of her court and turn toward something more theatrical. Versailles. The powdered corridors of French ambition await, and within them Maria Theresa of Spain, Isabella's great-niece will become a queen consort of France, a stranger in silk, a Habsburg in a hall of mirrors, and once again the bloodline will bend. Maria Theresa of Spain was born in 1638, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France, a union that blended Habsburg and Bourbon blood like a velvet-colored cocktail laced with too much history. The Spanish court into which she was born was one of heavy tapestries, black lace, and centuries of religious grief. By the time Maria Theresa took her first wobbly steps across its stone corridors, the bloodline was already buckling under its own tradition. Her parents were first cousins. Her grandparents were cousins. Her great-grandparents were also cousins. Maria Theresa was not the first product of these layers, but she was among the last that the system would claim with such calm inevitability. From the start, she was quiet, pious, and heartbreakingly obedient. She learned Spanish and Latin. She listened to priests more than poets. She was the sort of daughter the Habsburg court loved to praise, devout, decorous, and tragically destined for export, because her purpose, like so many daughters before her, was to be married. And the marriage they planned for her was nothing short of dynastic theater. France and Spain had been at war directly or indirectly for decades. The two great Catholic powers of Europe were in constant tug of war over territory prestige, and whose bloodlines were more Catholic than the popes. When peace finally came, it needed a signature, and that signature came in the form of a girl. Maria Theresa was chosen to marry Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. It was a brilliant political maneuver, at least on paper. Unite the Bourbon and Spanish Habsburg lines, heal the rift between two great thrones, secure peace through a wedding dress and a long candlelit procession. Maria Theresa, at the age of 20, packed her belongings, kissed her mother goodbye, and crossed the border into France. She met Louis XIV on an island in the middle of the Bidassoa River, a neutral zone chosen so that no one would have to bow first. It was theater from the very beginning. Louis took one look at her and said, "She is the Infanta of Spain," which, depending on how you read it, is either a diplomatic compliment or a polite way of saying, "She looks exactly like I expected, and I've already memorized her family tree." Because yes, they were cousins, multiple times over. Louis and Maria Theresa shared lineage from Philip III of Spain, and through interwoven marriages on both sides they were closer than most siblings should be. But again, papal dispensations had been issued. The flags were flying, the alliance was sealed. And Versailles awaited. Now Versailles was not the kind of place Maria Theresa was prepared for. She had grown up in the somber rituals of the Spanish court, where queens wore black, conversation was minimal, and piety meant silence. In France, everything sparkled. Mirrors, fountains, feathers. The court was dripping with pastel gossip and diamonds the size of eggs. Maria Theresa tried to adapt. She bore Louis 6 children. Only one survived the Dauphin Louis. The others died in infancy from smallpox convulsions, fevers, none of which surprised anyone. Child mortality was still common. But with a Habsburg queen and a Bourbon king, the stakes were higher. Every child born was both a future and a potential crack in the dynasty's already fragile genetic structure. Still she smiled. She hosted dinners. She prayed often. She drank hot chocolate daily, thick-spiced, almost syrupy, a tradition from her Spanish childhood. One courtier complained that her chambers always smelled faintly of cinnamon. She wrote letters to her family in Spain, each one careful, almost painfully bland. She missed home. She said it only once. But if Versailles had one rule, it was this: appearances mattered more than anything. Maria Theresa was not a political player like Isabella Clara Eugenia. She was not a regent or a negotiator or a strategist. She was a symbol, and she played her role well. Her face in portraits was always calm, her posture always serene. But beneath the courtly glaze, she was unraveling. Her husband Louis was not faithful. He had a string of mistresses, many of them appointed to the role almost formally. Madame de Montespan, Louise de la Vallière, There were children born outside the marriage, some legitimized, others not. Maria Theresa bore it all without protest. When someone once asked her how she dealt with the king's infidelities, she reportedly replied, "I do not see. I do not hear. I say nothing." Her health declined in her final years. She complained of fatigue migraines and melancholia. Her doctors applied leashes. Her confessors prescribed penance. Some modern historians suspect she may have had lupus or a thyroid disorder conditions that were undiagnosable in the 17th century, but are now associated with autoimmune and hereditary causes. She died in 1683 at the age of 44. The official cause was an abscess on her arm that turned gangrenous. She was gone within days. When told of her death, Louis said, "This is the first trouble she has given me." Whether that was grief or courtly detachment is unclear. What is clear is what came after. Her only surviving son would go on to marry another cousin. Their children would do the same. The Bourbon line in Spain would inherit her blood, her jawline, her melancholy, and eventually the throne. One particularly eerie legacy, her grandson Philip V would become the first Bourbon king of Spain. His marriage too would loop back into the same ancestral tree. The Habsburg inheritance, though supposedly passed on, would remain rooted in the same ground. Historians still debate whether Maria Theresa understood the full consequences of her marriage. She was educated, yes, but raised to obey, not to question. Did she know her children were at greater risk of genetic disease? Did she sense the weight of generations sitting in her womb? Or did she simply do what she had been taught to do, smile, submit, and produce, a quirky detail to hold onto Maria? Teresa kept a pet parrot that could speak in Spanish, French, and Latin. It once interrupted a royal mass with the words Ave Maria, but also Bonjour court chroniclers found this amusing. She did not. And so she faded. A Habsburg queen at a French court, a mother whose children died, a wife whose husband wandered, a woman whose name lived on not for what she did, but for what her blood would become. Next, we turn to another woman whose fate was sealed before her name was even known. A French princess who walked into the Spanish court with a library of letters and a dowry of doubt. Her name was Elizabeth of Valois, and she would carry the same burden of obedience expectation and unraveling genes wrapped as always in silk. Elizabeth of Valois was born into the French court with lace at her wrists and diplomacy in her veins. A daughter of Henry II of France and the formidable Catherine de' Medici, Elizabeth was never meant to live quietly. But like so many women in her tangled family tapestry, her future was drafted before she ever held a quill. She would not remain in France. She would not marry for love. She would cross the Pyrenees and become queen of a country that would expect everything of her and forgive her nothing. Born in 1545, Elizabeth was a golden child, bright, reserved, and with a natural grace that made her the favorite of many at court. Her mother Catherine may be better remembered for political ruthlessness and suspected poisonings, but she adored her daughter. Elizabeth was raised in the Louvre with a blend of French elegance and Italian style, fluent in Spanish and schooled in Latin philosophy and court etiquette before she turned 12. She was, in every sense, a gift waiting to be handed off. That handoff came in 1559. France and Spain, those two uneasy neighbors forever circling each other like crowned wolves, had finally agreed to peace after years of war. But peace, as ever, needed a bride. And the one chosen was Elizabeth. Originally, she was to marry Don Carlos, the son of Philip II of Spain. But when Carlos's instability became too alarming to ignore, he was violently erratic and possibly mentally ill. The plan changed. And so Elizabeth married his father instead. Yes, she was originally intended to marry the son, but instead she became the fifth wife of Philip II, a man 20 years her senior and already twice widowed. She was just 14. He was 32. Their shared lineage. Well, as always, the family tree barely stretched. Elizabeth's paternal grandmother was Claude of France. Philip's mother, Isabella of Portugal, was the granddaughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who, through the usual web of cousin marriages, were also related to Elizabeth. Once again, the DNA did not wander far. Still, by many accounts, the marriage was not an unhappy one. Philip, often cold and austere, with others warmed to Elizabeth. She was gentle, intelligent, and notably well suited to the sombre rhythm of the Spanish court. Her French laughter softened the edges of Philip's rigid world. She was curious and read widely, and though she rarely challenged her husband openly, she managed to find quiet ways to carve out intellectual space for herself. At first, the Spanish court regarded her with suspicion. She was too foreign, too young, too fashionable, but she soon won over the courtiers with her piety and restraint. She adopted Spanish customs, wore the heavy black silks, attended the endless masses. She did everything expected of a queen and more. But when it came time to fulfill her true duty, producing heirs, the old Habsburg pattern began to repeat. Elizabeth became pregnant 6 times. Only 2 daughters survived. The rest were miscarried or died in infancy. The pressure on her was immense. And though Philip did not publicly shame her, he remained more devoted to her than he had to his other wives. The anxiety of childlessness grew thicker with each passing year. Spain needed a male heir. Elizabeth's body could not or would not produce one. Historians still debate the cause of these repeated losses. Was it a genetic incompatibility? A blood disorder passed silently through centuries of cousin matching? Some speculate Elizabeth may have carried a gene that made pregnancy dangerous. Others argue the Spanish court's punishing expectations and near-monastic environment may have contributed to her declining health. Her letters, which survive in fragments, hint at loneliness. She writes of aching limbs of fear in the night of asking for holy intercession when another child failed to thrive. One of her confidants described her as a candle always burning at both ends, referring both to her beauty and to her quiet exhaustion. A quirky detail, Elizabeth had a deep love for gardens. In the sterile, incense-drenched atmosphere of the Spanish court, she created small oases, tiny enclosed spaces filled with jasmine and citrus trees. Her French origins showed most clearly in these spaces where she could breathe for a moment and remember the soft perfumes of the Tuileries and the laughter of her youth. In 1568, after yet another failed pregnancy, Elizabeth fell seriously ill. She suffered fevers, confusion, and abdominal pain. Some claimed it was a miscarriage gone terribly wrong. Others believed it was an untreated infection. Whatever the cause, her health collapsed quickly. She died at the age of 23. The Spanish court mourned, but without drama. Philip was devastated but composed. A marble tomb was commissioned, a procession was held, and then, as always, history turned the page. Elizabeth of Valois is rarely remembered outside of footnotes. She wasn't a political titan or a regent. She didn't reshape borders or crown new kings. But in her short life, she became the embodiment of what the Habsburg experiment had turned into: a woman barely out of childhood, burdened with the entire weight of Europe's genetic ambition, expected to bring forth an heir with blood that was already too thick with repetition. Her daughters would go on to marry into the same families. The Habsburg-Bourbon bridge she represented would hold briefly before it began to splinter. And though her name faded, the portraits remained: a pale face, heavy-lidded eyes, a small Habsburg chin just beginning to protrude. In those portraits, she looks almost like a ghost already. Next, we turn not to a princess or a queen, but to something more symbolic. We turn to the jaw. The Habsburg jaw, visible in portraits, whispered about in court halls, mocked in pamphlets, is more than a facial feature. It is the marker of an empire closing in on itself, and it's time we looked at the face that launched 1,000 whispered diagnoses. The Habsburg jaw. You have probably seen it perhaps in a somber oil painting hanging in some echoing European gallery, or peeking out from a 17th century coin, or even making the rounds in a meme caught awkwardly between history and punchline. That unmistakable jutting lower jaw, too long, too proud, too burdened, was more than a quirk. It was a signature. A visible marker of the most famous royal bloodline in Europe, folding in on itself century after century until its legacy was carved into bone. Medically, it's called mandibular prognathism. In lay terms, it means your lower jaw extends far beyond your upper one, causing a pronounced underbite. In mild forms, it can be lived with. In more severe cases, and the Habsburgs had plenty, it can interfere with speech, eating, breathing, and even sleeping. But for this royal family, it wasn't just a medical issue. It became a symbol, a crown beneath the crown. And it started slowly. In the early generations, if you flip through portraits of Maximilian, poor Philip the Handsome, or even Charles V, you'll notice that the features are still mostly balanced. Strong noses, high foreheads, classical profiles. But by the mid-1500s, as cousin married cousin and then niece married uncle, the geometry of the face began to shift. The chins elongated, the lips no longer met. The mouth sagged slightly open in portrait after portrait, a grim echo of a decision made centuries earlier to marry inward, always inward. The same traits show up again and again like brushstrokes in a repeating pattern. That forward jutting jaw, that narrow palate. The eyes often too close together or sunken, the lower lip thick and pendulous. In some cases, the upper jaw was so underdeveloped that eating required specialized utensils or food pre-chewed and mashed. You wouldn't know that from the official court portraits, of course. Artists were instructed to flatter, but not too much. They painted what they saw, but softened it with shadow and pose. A head tilted just so. A hand thoughtfully resting on a chin. A closed mouth rendered just before the artist packed up their palette. And no one spoke about it. To speak openly about the deformities of the ruling house would be treason or heresy. This was God's chosen family. Their bodies were sacred, their blood divine. And if that blood produced strange faces or strange behaviors, then perhaps God was testing them or the rest of Europe. But even if no one said it out loud, they knew. Court physicians knew. Foreign ambassadors knew. The servants who cleaned up after royal dinners knew. The ones who laced up the velvet robes, who tucked away the soiled linens after long, hard nights of royal suffering, they knew. One of the most striking examples is Emperor Leopold I, who ruled in the late 1600s. His portraits are astonishing. The jaw dominates his entire lower face. The lips hang open. The nose seems to retreat beneath the weight of that bone. He looks in many depictions like a man caught mid-transformation into something else, half divine, half tragic. His marriage, of course, was to a cousin. His children, of course, repeated the cycle. Contemporary observers noticed. One ambassador from Venice described a gathering of Habsburg relatives as a painting hung too many times in a hall of mirrors. A courtier from France once joked quietly, and only in writing, that the Spanish royal family had mouths designed to pray, but not to speak. Spanish poets, in moments of less pious restraint, referred to faces turned heavenward, for they could not face forward. Still, the dynasty carried on. The Habsburgs didn't see the jaw as a flaw. If anything, they came to treat it as a kind of royal seal proof of dynastic purity, a reminder that they had married well, that they had kept their blood holy. Never mind that it was also slowly killing them, because the jaw was only the visible part. Underneath the skin, other problems multiplied: inherited blood disorders, neurological issues, infertility, seizures, severe depression. A growing dependence on holy relics and obsessive religious rituals to cope with the physical and emotional pain. The same mutations that shape the jaw may have compromised their immune systems, their endocrine systems, and their ability to carry pregnancies to term. Some modern scientists speculate that endocrine disorders common in the Habsburg line may have contributed to their high rates of miscarriages, early deaths, and psychological instability. One famous modern genetic study examined over 600 years of Habsburg marriages and concluded that the inbreeding coefficient, the measure of how closely related two parents are, was so high it rivaled that of isolated mountain communities. The average Habsburg marriage from the 16th to the 17th century involved a relatedness closer than that of a modern brother and sister. Historians still debate how much the family knew. Certainly they observed the patterns, the babies that didn't survive, the sons who couldn't walk, the daughters who bled too much or not at all. Medical advisors began quietly recommending that matches be made outside the family. But papal dispensations were still granted. Politics always won. And politics said marry within, because to marry outside risked diluting the claim. Bringing in new blood meant bringing in new houses, new hands on the scepter. And so the spiral continued, downward, inward. Some of the worst cases were hidden. Infants with extreme deformities were quietly baptized, then quietly buried. Others were sent to remote convents or monasteries where their names were scrubbed from official records. One archivist centuries later described finding boxes of letters that referred to the child who never learned to blink, or the boy who smiled only once and never again. But others, those destined to inherit, had to be shown. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the Habsburg jaw had become something else entirely. His face was the full consequence of a dynasty that had turned itself into a genetic echo. His tongue was so large he could barely speak, his jaw so pronounced he could not chew, his body so frail he could not walk until nearly age 8. His mind, that's still debated. Some say he was intellectually delayed. Others say he was painfully aware of his brokenness, which may have been worse. And still, he became king, because there was no one else. His mother Mariana of Austria was both his aunt and his cousin. Let that sink in. Charles was the full stop at the end of a sentence too long. He was the final echo of a plan set in motion over 300 years earlier, when marriage was diplomacy and daughters were currency and blood was sacred so long as it was the same. And yet, even in his portrait, the jaw is not hidden. It's there, huge, tragic, unmistakable. The face of empire cracked but crowned. Next we meet Charles properly, not as a footnote, not as a caricature, but as a boy born into pain who was told to rule, the last of the line, the body of a crumbling world. Charles II of Spain entered the world on November the 6th, 1661, a child born under the gilded ceilings of the royal palace in Madrid, surrounded by courtiers whispering prayers and physicians already looking nervous. Even before he cried, he was a matter of national concern. And once he did, it wasn't quite right. His face was swollen. His eyes were unfocused. His tongue, large, unwieldy, seemed too big for his mouth. His jaw, unmistakably Habsburg, jutted forward so sharply that it caused a murmur in the room. The midwife swaddled him in silk. The priest offered thanks, and the court began to pretend that everything was fine, but everything was not fine. Charles was the final product of over 200 years of royal inbreeding. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His maternal grandfather was also his paternal grandfather. His maternal grandmother was also his paternal aunt. The family tree wasn't a tree anymore. It was a noose, a delicate golden noose lined with holy relics and Latin prayers and centuries of names repeating like echoes in a cathedral. From the beginning, Charles was different. He couldn't walk properly. He couldn't chew food and was fed mostly soft mush until he was nearly an adult. He spoke late. Some say he barely spoke at all before the age of 4. When he did, his words were slurred and slow, often unintelligible. His head was large, his limbs thin and twisted, his eyes always watery, rarely met anyone else's for long. At court ceremonies, he was dressed in the finest robes, his body propped up like a living statue. He was paraded, not presented, but he was the king, because there was no one else. Spain, by that point, was an empire in decline. Its wars had drained its coffers. Its colonies were restless. Its people were starving in certain regions, yet the court remained opulent, an illusion sustained by ceremony and denial. And Charles, poor boy, became the most potent symbol of that illusion. A broken body wearing a perfect crown. He was coronated at just 4 years old. The regency fell to his mother, Mariana of Austria. She ruled in his name, but was often overwhelmed, unpopular, and heavily influenced by her Jesuit confessors and court favorites. Her attention was divided between palace intrigue and her son's fragile health, and both seemed to spiral out of her control. She ordered constant medical treatment, bleedings, Purda's tonic, even powdered gemstones, anything to improve Charles's condition. Nothing worked, because it wasn't illness, it was inheritance. The Spanish people called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. It was easier to believe that Charles had been cursed than to admit that the monarchy had done this to itself. Rumors spread that a witch had stolen his vitality, that an enemy had buried a hex beneath his cradle, that the devil himself sat behind his eyes. Exorcisms were performed, holy water was sprinkled over his food, sacred relics were placed in his chambers. At one point, a priest even suggested burning a child-sized effigy of the king as a symbolic purging of the evil within. Charles bore it all with quiet endurance. He grew into adolescence with limited understanding of governance and no control over his own life. His days were structured around mass mealtimes and inspections by court doctors. He had no formal education. His tutors were instructed to keep lessons gentle. He was rarely left alone. His closest companion was a dwarf named Nicolasito, who accompanied him on walks through the palace gardens and whispered court gossip into his ear. In his 20s, Charles was married twice. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a lively, intelligent Bourbon princess from France. She arrived at the Spanish court at age 17, full of hope, dressed in silks, ready to charm. But the moment she met Charles, she is said to have turned pale. The two were biologically related, of course, cousins several times over, but their differences went far beyond blood. Charles could barely communicate. He drooled. He needed help dressing. He had few teeth. Marie-Louise tried to make the best of it, but she quickly fell into despair. Letters home reveal her isolation, her horror at court rituals, her disgust with Spanish food, and above all, her sadness at her husband's condition. They never produced children. After her death, possibly from anorexia, possibly from sadness, or maybe even poison, depending on which letter you read, Charles married again. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen for her large family. The Spanish hoped her fertility might overcome the king's difficulties. But again, there were no children. None. The Habsburg line, once so desperate to preserve itself, had finally reached the end. Charles's reign was marked by stagnation. He issued few decisions of his own. Ministers and regents ruled in his name. The economy faltered. The colonies grumbled. The court became a nest of paranoid factions. And still Charles lingered alive, technically, but never truly present. In his 30s, he deteriorated rapidly. He lost much of his eyesight, his body swelled and shrank erratically. He suffered seizures and chronic diarrhea. His speech, already slurred, became almost incomprehensible. One doctor claimed he had the body of a 70-year-old and the mind of a child. Another, more candid, declared this body is not the work of nature but of sorcery. And yet Charles lived, perhaps out of spite, perhaps out of stubborn Habsburg endurance. He died on November 1st, 1700, at the age of 38. His autopsy, preserved in court records, is grim. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines putrefied. He had a single testicle, black as coal, his head full of water. Historians still debate the precise nature of his conditions. Some suggest pituitary insufficiency, others propose Fragile X syndrome. Nearly all agree that his features and behavior were the predictable consequence of centuries of consanguinity, and when he died, he took the Spanish Habsburg dynasty with him. The throne passed to Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince. War erupted over the succession. Europe reeled. The Habsburgs, though still powerful in Austria, had lost their Spanish heart, all because they clung too tightly to blood, to tradition, to a name. Charles II was not a failure. He was a monument, not to madness or weakness, but to the dangers of unyielding legacy. A boy king born from 100 treaties, a man who bore in his bones the blueprint of an empire that could not change. And now, as the candle gutters low and the echoes of that long history quiet in your ears, you can let go of all that. Close your eyes, breathe. The kings, the queens, the bloodline, all are dust now. And now the tale softens. The torches flicker lower in the great halls of memory, and the marble corridors fall quiet. The names, so many names, drift like dry leaves across the pages of history. Isabella, Joanna, Margaret, Charles. Each one born into duty, cloaked in velvet, hemmed in by gold and silence. You've heard their stories, felt their weight. You've walked beside girls made queens before they were women. You've watched alliances sealed not with kisses but contracts. And you followed a bloodline that wound tighter and tighter until it cracked, until a jaw no longer closed, until a body could no longer carry a crown. It wasn't vanity, it wasn't greed. It was fear tradition and the slow forgetting of choice. The belief that names must stay pure, that power must stay close, that the body would endure what the mind denied. But it didn't. Not always. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it screamed, and in the end it stopped. Now the royal beds are empty, the velvet rot, the Habsburg name echoes in empty palaces carved into lintels above doors no one walks through anymore. The blood has thinned, the mirrors no longer reflect those familiar faces. The jaw has relaxed, and you've survived the spiral. You've listened. You've borne witness to something strange and sad and soft-spun through centuries wrapped in robes and rituals and quiet suffering. And now, it's time to let it all go. Let your breath slow. Let your body soften. Let your mind drift. They've ruled enough for tonight. Now it's your turn to rest. Good night.